Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's great to be in Belgrade, my first time in the deep Balkans, if I call it that, if we leave Greece out. I had the opportunity yesterday to walk around in the city, and I thought the weather was wonderful, and I had a nice nostalgic feeling about the city and about East Europe. So for somebody coming from the north, that's always a welcome sense. Okay, so I was invited to this conference on ontology, even though people, I suppose, know that I have a great difficulty with words such as ontology. When I heard as a small boy the word ontology in my philosophy class, I fell asleep. And I've never really recovered from that reaction to those kinds of languages. And so what I'm going to do to you, what I'm going to thrust upon you, is just a series of reflections on institutional developments in international law and international institutions, the institutional world of international law. I call this hegemonic regimes, the politics of redefinition, because I'm going to report to you on a certain new type of politics that is very prevalent in the international world, the world of international institutions. Although I'm more comfortable with the word regimes, because that's the word my profession, lawyers use, I could as well talk of hegemonic institutions. But as I said, it's focused on the international world, the international diplomacy, United Nations, European Union, and the various specialized agencies, organs that are out there. I'm going to sketch to you a new politics that I see out there. But first I need to start with the laying out a strong sentiment among international lawyers such as myself that the center has been imploding, and that in the first phase in the 1960s, 1970s, and then in a second phase in the 1990s, the institutional environment that we used to have and that concentrated on the public diplomacy of the United Nations, in which a single set of institutions, rather hierarchically organized, at the top of which on the political side was the UN Security Council, maybe at the top of which on the judicial side would have been the International Court of Justice in The Hague, had just completely been left aside from new developments. In the 1960s, 1970s, with the entry of the third world in universal international institutions, the preferences of the third world were embodied in a set of projects that was institutionalized under the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. Under the UNCTAD itself, several operations and institutional activities started to take place, and the point was that these institutional activities would no longer be just reflective of the old traditional preferences, biases and priorities of the UN institutions, but would be specifically development-oriented. At the same time, the development of human rights law institutionalized the two covenants, the Civil and Political Covenant 1966, the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Covenant, with their implementation bodies, the 1975 Helsinki Agreement, etc. Again, a new set of professionals, a new set of institutions, and a new ethos, which wasn't precisely the kind of diplomatic ethos that used to exist in the United Nations, indeed, which to some extent saw that key notions of that older world, such as sovereignty, were part of the problem. And they thought of themselves as against all that. Environmental institutions, the Stockholm Declaration 1972, the establishment of the UN Environment Program in Nairobi, where it's still today, and international environmental law, which started, again, causes, institutional activities in environmental law with a specific ethos. The UN Law of the Sea Conference started in 1974. I don't need to go through all of this. 1977, the Geneva Conference on Humanitarian Law, 2 new treaties, a set of institutions. And much of this was, I would say, intellectually articulated in Wolfgang Friedman's The Changing Structures of International Law, which is an epoch book which lays out what he calls the contrast between a law of coordination, old law which used to coordinate sovereign activities, and a new law of cooperation, which leads into specific teleological, future-oriented projects in several fields. And in the 1990s, in the second wave, after the political transitions in Europe, all of these developments, apart from the UNCTAD, the developing countries, of course, lost it. But other activities were intensified. Trade law emerged, so the old arrangement of the GATT, the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, which was meant as a temporary arrangement in 1947 when it was set up, was replaced by an institution, the World Trade Organization. And trade law became a big hit. All the ambitious boys and girls in my class wanted to become trade lawyers, and they shared a certain ethos. They thought the world of things such as free trade, protection of intellectual property, etc. Investment law. So with the effort of the OECD to set up a special institution, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, that didn't work out, but all the energy went into this huge effort of conducting bilateral investment talks between countries, and that there are now more than 3,000 bilateral investment treaties which regulate international investment rather completely, and which has an ethos of its own. Then after the Twin Towers, security. Now a number of ambitious boys and girls in the law school want to become security law kinds of people with the security institutions, etc. International criminal law. I don't need to stress in this country the great ideological importance that the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, ICTR, the Rwanda Tribunal, ICC, the International Criminal Court, all of that has had. So international law, or many international lawyers are participating in what they call the fight against impunity, which is yet another institutional structure. And that is embodied in another epoch book, Thomas Frank's Fairness in International Law and Institutions. So this is my starting point. To put it bluntly, where I grew up as an international lawyer, I was taught to think that there is this single structure, kind of a liberal law which peaks in the United Nations activities, which leads towards international constitutionalism, all this Kantian stuff that the profession brings with it. And that to be an international lawyer had a definite sense. Now all of that's gone, and nobody really, no ambitious student, to make this point again, wants to become an international lawyer. They want to become international humanitarian lawyers. They want to become human rights lawyers. They want to become environment lawyers. They want to become trade lawyers. They want to become etc., etc., etc. Okay, and I suggest that this is these are the themes of political controversy in the international professional world today. So let me just give you an example. So this is, I could have chosen any example, but I just choose the Loiseau case from the European Court of Human Rights. This was a case in which which dealt with Turkey's occupation of northern Cyprus and the question of whether the Turkish delimitation of the Declaration of Acceptance of the European Convention on Human Rights could be assessed and adjudged by the European Court in Strasbourg, by those people. And under general international law, the old law that we used to have, it was a clear rule in customary law and in treaty law that the institutions called upon to implement multilateral treaties did not have authority over the parties, so that they could not interpret the treaties in an authoritative way against the parties. Not to speak of interpreting the declarations of acceptance by the parties of the jurisdiction of somebody. The European Court of Human Rights, however, is an activist institution. It thinks the world of human rights, it thinks human rights is the greatest thing since motherhood and apple pie, and it wants it to be all over the place. And it knows that the best way to do this is to expand its own jurisdiction as widely as possible. And so in this case it said this, that a fundamental difference in the role and purpose of the respective tribunals, that is to say the old tribunals, the International Court of Justice, and the new tribunal, the European Court of Human Rights, provides a compelling basis for distinguishing convention practice from that of the International Court. So it's a technical statement, but of huge momentum, because the human rights people here say, well, you old guys, you may have some principles or laws, but they don't just apply to us. Because we are different, because we are special, we are human rights. And these kinds of statements have been proliferating, but not only by human rights institutions, but by other institutions. The appellate body of the World Trade Organization, the main institutional actor in the trade field, has made statements of the same kind. Now, this is rather a technical point. So all of this world of international institutions is, of course, based on international treaties. And the world of international treaty law is governed by 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which says that when an institution implements a treaty, then the institution shall take into account any relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between parties. And I'm sorry to thrust this bureaucratic language at your face, but I need to show where the politics of law in the international world now lies. It lies in understandings of expressions such as this. So the Vienna Convention is an old world kind of a convention. It says that these special obligations, the special treaties, human rights, humanitarian law, trade, investment, criminal law, should all somehow be integrated, so that when a body implements one treaty, it should always read that treaty in the context of all the other treaties, so that it imagines that the world is like this puzzle, the legal world, in which all the obligations and rights of everybody fit together coterminously, so that there is no tragic fundamental conflict between the obligations and rights that we have. Now that's an ideological position which is very typical for international lawyers. Harmony of interests, the idea that somehow ultimately the world, the rights of people come together, that there is no tragic conflict. This is reflected, for instance, in the WTO, this old ethos, in the statement by the appellate body in 1996 in a case that had to do with a typical political and legal conflict, namely conflict between trade and environment. And the appellate body said in that judgment, the WTO agreements, trade, should not be read in clinical isolation from public international law. Now, the members of the panel were old guard people, and they were thinking, well, you know, things should fit together. You know, we are not, as trade lawyers, clinically isolated from all the rest. You know, we are friends. We go out and have dinner in Geneva all the time. Nevertheless, the drafting of the dispute settlement understanding that is at the core of the new trade law, the WTO treaties, has the provision, Article 3, Paragraph 2 of the dispute settlement understanding, which embodies the new ethos, which says that recommendations and rulings of the dispute settlement body, that is to say the appellate body, cannot add to or diminish the rights and obligations provided in the covered agreements in trade law. This means I would say if this were a class back home, in good Finnish, but I would have to say in good English, this means that trade law institutions apply only trade law. That whatever other agreements there may be have no interest to us. So, as you can see, the two statements are opposite. One says trade should be integrated. The other one said trade is alone and nothing that's outside trade should deal with trade. Here is a hopeless diplomatic effort to try to mitigate these conflicts. This is an environmental treaty in the conclusion of which trade issues were big. So this is an implementation protocol of the International Biodiversity Convention adopted in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. There's a Cartagena protocol on diversity. Now, obviously, the biodiversity issue has huge economic consequences, especially for the protection of intellectual property. So patents on plants, to make it very simple. And medical companies have huge interests in having those patents enforced. And that enforcement takes place under another WTO agreement, the TRIPS agreement, the Trade in Industrial Properties. The TRIPS agreement is a capitalist kind of an agreement, so to make things simple, but true. It's a capitalist kind of thing. It protects medical companies. It was negotiated within WTO institutions in which those kinds of interests are preferred. The Cartagena Protocol was negotiated differently by environmentalists and biodiversity people with those kinds of ethos and preferences. And at the conclusion of the protocol, the two groups started to fight with each other. Do we go by the way of intellectual property or protection of biodiversity? And this is the end result. I just put it out there because I think it's such great fun. Nobody understands really what this it's clearly a compromise, and it's clearly a tortuous compromise. It took ages of the negotiators to get to this language which says on the one hand that trade people and environment people should be friends and should go out together and accommodate and talk to each other. Then it says that, well, this protocol shall not affect TRIPS people. So in the second paragraph is, well, intellectual property agreements shall not be affected by this. And then the third paragraph, which well, actually, we don't want to subordinate ourselves to the intellectual property people. So it's kind of a statement of a conflict. And the conflict, of course, continues because environment and trade are in tragic contradiction with each other. Now I come to my point. This could say institutional hegemony. Regimes, that is to say, regimes such as environmental law, trade law, human rights law, humanitarian law, investment law, intellectual property law. Such regimes are both solipsistic and imperialistic in a way that we find very familiar from the old world too, when states, sovereign states used to be the relevant regimes and often looked at the world from perspectives that were both solipsistic and imperialistic. What does this mean? Well, solipsism first. Well, for every regime, the world is always articulated from the perspective of the professional vocabulary of that regime. My friend David Kennedy says at this point usually that for a person with a hammer, every problem is a nail. So if you are an environmentalist, say, then you think the world's problems are all about environment. And you read the world, as it were, from the perspective of your environmentalism. The messages the world gives you are about environmental destruction, etc. So you see only yourself. You are the baby who looks in the mirror and thinks that I am the world and the world exists for me as a function of my language and my... And that's what regimes do. Human rights lawyers read the world in terms of so many human rights problems that they have to deal with. Security law people read the world in terms of so many security problems out there which they have to deal with, etc. Now, they're also imperialistic, because, and this is a logical conclusion of solipsism. So they also impose their preferences on the world at large. So the European Court of Human Rights in the Loiseau case said that, well, actually you may have whatever preferences, but we human rights people have these preferences, and we will therefore deal with the matter through our preferences. Environmentalists, security people alike, we all feel that we are under constant attack by these various solipsistic imperial structures of thinking and acting. And I want to analogize this to the old world, which I understand better, in which states were like this. States accepted international legal agreements only through their own constitutional machineries. They translated the international world to their own legal language by reference to their own constitution. And when other people were saying, hey, you should do this or that, they said, well, why? Well, I haven't accepted this. They had an imperial attitude. They would only accept whatever they accept, and others shut up. That is the significance of sovereignty. Okay, so I tell you, the political struggle, the most important, by far, political struggle in the world today is not between states. It's not military use of force somewhere. It is the conflicts of institutions, or regimes as I call them, translating the world in their own terms, exercising authority, because they are the authoritative people in those terms, over all others. And who shall win? Well, here's an example of a conflict. The Sellafield nuclear facility in England was, in the early 2000s, was suspected of having created nuclear fallout into the Irish Sea. Sellafield is just on the brink of the Irish Sea, and Ireland is on the other side. And the Irish obviously protested. You know, you can't, you Brits, you can't. You've already been an imperial power over us for hundreds of years, and now you are polluting us through your Sellafield facility. But the Brits said, well, no, okay, so that's your problem. We need to provide energy for our industries. And so Ireland took the matter to three different organizations. One, it took it to the institutions of the so-called OSPAR Convention. So this is Oslo and Paris Conventions. This is a series of conventions having to do with the protection of the North Sea. Second, they took it under into an arbitration under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a universal convention that had to do with various aspects of the uses of the law of the sea. And then thirdly, the matter came up by the Commission of the European Union in the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. So three different bodies were involved. And I've cited here the language of the arbitral body under the North Sea Convention. And the arbitral body lays clearly out what is at issue in this jurisdictional conflict. Even if the Oslo and Paris, no, sorry, this is the UNCLOS arbitration, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea Arbitration, which looks at the same matter is being dealt with in Paris, in Hamburg, in the UN, and in Luxembourg. And the Hamburg, the UN body says, even if the Paris people and the European Union people have treaties that contain rights or obligations similar to ours, the rights and obligations under these agreements have a separate existence. So even if all these three arrangements have the same provision, do not pollute, they all should be interpreted and understood differently by reference to the institutional regime in which they are embedded. It's no surprise how this case came out then in the end. How did it? Well, the European Court of Justice said it's just a European question and we decide. And the European Court of Justice has the Brussels machinery to implement it. The United Nations and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Hamburg Tribunal, as well as the Arbitral Tribunal under the North Sea Convention, both gave the case up to Brussels, because Brussels is the imperial center, and it was able to go by it. Of course, one could ask, well, how can one decide this kind of a jurisdictional problem? When there should have to be some Supreme Court over there with a long white beard, and this would decide then. It goes over there, it goes... Well, there is no such thing. So the struggle is interminable, and everybody is solipsistic and imperialistic. And the one will win who thinks he is able to get away with it. And the EU has always been a body like that. So it became clear that much depends on how you define a dispute. Because once you define a dispute or a matter, you know which body will deal with it. Now, things do not... so how, in the regular conflict between trade and environment, how do we know whether a conflict is really a conflict that's environmental or really a conflict that's about trade and commerce? Well, it's neither really one nor the other. It becomes something only as a matter of telling the conflict or telling the matter in some language. And so the institutional conflict nowadays is these institutions, these specialized institutions, constantly reinterpreting the world in their own language so as to be able to exercise authority on the world. Okay, but is there no limit? Well, I suggest to you there is no limit to this retelling. Now, human rights people were scandalized over Guantanamo once upon a time. No longer, because Guantanamo is just our daily reality. But once upon a time, they thought that much depends on not thinking of the Guantanamo prisoners in terms of the security language that brought them there, but instead the human rights language that should bring them out from Guantanamo. Right. Now, but how do we know whether the Guantanamo issue is really a security issue or a human rights issue? Well, no, it isn't really. It's, again, which preferences do you want to apply? Then you choose the language. Or maybe better, which is your language? And then you choose to apply that language. So this is a real case. So Mr. Al-Jeddah was a British Iraqi national citizen. He was apprehended in Iraq in the course of the illegal war in Iraq and was put in incommunicado detention for a year. He was a British citizen, an Iraqi citizen. So he complained, obviously, in the British courts, saying that his human rights have been violated, damn it. Magna Carta and all that. So this is Britain. How can you do this thing? So human rights. And so this is what the British High Court responded to that claim. It said that, well, the British operation, this is on the basis, so this is the Iraqi, this is the first Iraqi war. The Security Council, charged as is with the primary responsibility, has determined that a multinational force is required in Iraq. So this is before the 2003, before the illegal war, I'm sorry. So this is the enforcement of the mother to all resolutions, the previous Iraqi war, where there was a Security Council authorization. And then it says that the multinational force had an objective to protect human rights, because security in Iraq is a human right of the Iraqi, and therefore the incommunicado detention of the British citizen was a human rights measure. And I'm not pointing this out to you in order to argue that the British judges are in bad faith or are somehow wickedly reinterpreting the world in a vicious way. Actually, it's true that the security in Iraq is very important for the Iraqi. We may disagree on how that security should be brought out, but if it can be realized, then surely that's important for huge numbers of Iraqi. And if that then requires the incommunicado detention of people, then surely that has to be undertaken. Well, you could say, well, there's one human right against another human right. Yes, that's how international tribunals, human rights tribunals deal with the matter. But then they also have an ideology that human rights are inalienable, indivisible, and complete. So how can you prefer one human right to another? And more importantly, where does the standard come from that allows you to put rights in a hierarchical relationship to each other? We could go there, but I don't have the time. Here is just to make the point that anything can be described as anything. The Iraqi war could be, and was often described in journals as an economic warfare to make clear access to Middle Eastern oil. It could also be articulated in standard terms of security in the Middle East and so on. Let me give you an example of the politics of redefinition. So, sometime in the 1970s, and I have a theory about this, we can go into this in discussion, but I don't have the time. Sometime in the 1970s, people started to address social political issues in human rights language. And, of course, the background was the 1966 Civil and Political Covenant on the one hand, the Economic Social Rights Covenant, the Helsinki Process, and all of that. And people had recourse to human rights language because of the hardness of that language, because it seemed to enable the possessor of the language to say that this is how far something can go and no further. It put what looked like an absolute limit to the discretion of state officials, administrators, and so on. Even if economic calculations would show that if it would be an optimal result to lift half of the poor population in Belgrade to live somewhere in the forests, those people must have the right to say, no, I have a right to stay where I am. People needed those kinds of standards. And in the 1970s, many of us saw in the law schools, I wasn't in the law school at that time, but those who were saw that a book called Taking Rights Seriously emerged on tables, and they thought, wow, this is impressive. And they started to talk in rights terms. And very soon everything became a right. So civil and political rights, yes, but on the other hand, economic, social, and cultural rights. Yes, but on the other hand, right to environment, right to peace, right to development, etc. And all of these rights are in a complicated relationship to each other. The transformation of stuff into rights language was an effort to redescribe reality so that one can have a handle on that reality. That project was successful for some time until now rights are neither here nor there. Everything is a right, and when everything is a right, nothing is a right. There is no limit to this redescription. So the new languages of power will have to be and are invented constantly. So this is the politics of rights. The politics of redefinition. Institutions specialized in particular languages, constantly reinterpreting the world in terms of their own language in order to take jurisdiction, exercise authority over that reality. So, security languages, there's a struggle over who owns that language. People, so my left friend, so security language originally is a right-wing language. Right, so we know this. But my pacifist friends and my left friends very rapidly learned to use the language by adding the word human there. Human security. Aha, it's not about, it's no longer about tanks and military planes and bombs. It's now about providing social welfare, about providing security for expecting mothers, providing security for school children during the day, food security. The food experts very rapidly saw that, well, if all the resources are going to these security people, we are no longer going to have any. So we start to talk of our food preferences in terms of food security. But then the security people responded by saying, well, one must have a right to security, so that they translated their own preferences in human rights language, etc. Trade, in the same way. So the issue of sustainability that emerged in trade language is an effort by environmentalists to reinterpret trade language in their own terms by speaking of sustainable trade. And maybe they will win, maybe they don't. The struggle is out there. The environmental languages are reinterpreted by military experts, by security experts, and by property experts. So environmental issues to a great extent in the developed North, issues about how forest owners can deal with the forestry in ways in which they think is both profitable and in accordance with their preferences. The issue of the prohibition of war has been addressed in the 1996 case in the International Court of Justice on the threat or use of nuclear weapons by reference to environmental standards. So just war is a war that can be waged in an environmentally Pyrrhistine way. It's an argument made by my friend Philip Sands in that case. So war as environmentalism, peace, justice, international criminal law, fight against impunity. All of these new languages are about who should have the right to the last word. In the former Yugoslavian conflict, I was constantly, I used to be in the foreign ministry as a legal advisor and all that, so I was constantly mediating between my political colleagues who were saying, no, the Yugoslavian conflict is about peace and reconciliation, and all these things about international criminal tribunals will just make work more difficult. So keep out of here, you criminal lawyers. And the criminal lawyers were, of course, no, it's a question of justice here, and we are the experts of justice, so let's talk in terms of justice. The old contradiction between peace and justice. Who gets to define what's at issue? I know I'm going fast. This is the last slide, and it's a last point I want to make. It's about the strategic choices that all of us have to face. There is no non-linguistic way of addressing the reality. We have to use some language to translate the word, but we need to be strategic about what language we use. So in the last 10 years, I've often been involved in debates between development experts and human rights experts about how development, that is to say, development assistance in the third world, should be made more human rights friendly. And human rights people are often worried, and have been worried, that development assistance or development activities don't really respect the human rights of people, indigenous peoples, of women, of children, of the poor. It's too oriented towards the hard values, etc. And so in the European Union and in the United Nations, something has been invented. One way of going about these things is to invent abbreviations. So HRBA, You know that one? HRBA. Human rights-based approach to development. Right. Human rights-based approach to development. And my institute in Helsinki, that's another institutional actor, was called upon by the foreign ministry to produce a report on human rights-based approach to development. And we could immediately see that this was about trying to find the way in which two languages can interpenetrate. The language of development and the language of human rights. Neither one of these languages was politically innocent. The development people came from they were mostly male, they had spent long times in Africa, they were economic experts, they were experts in reconstruction and agriculture, and their preferences were those kinds of preferences. The human rights people were mostly female, their experience had been in Geneva and at international institutions, maybe the UNHCR, maybe the International Criminal Court, etc. They were on different preferences. And so in this study we needed to ask, well, how does one translate development into human rights language? How does one go about that? Well, one way would be to say that let's organize courses for development people on human rights, and let's have these women talk to these men at courses. But many human rights people said, no, that's not enough, we don't believe, this wasn't their language, but immediately one could realize that this was at issue, that we are unable to indoctrinate them in a one-week course, for instance, even it's an intense course and we can use all the informal ways of indoctrination that we have at issue. And so the other one would be, well, when we send a development team somewhere, let's put in a couple of human rights experts in the development team, which is what the European Union recommends. Okay, so that's what you try. So what does the human rights person do there? So what usually happens is this, and what we wanted to avoid, and I go to how you avoid it there. That the development team goes out there, and the human rights person sits in the corner. And the development team does what it does, constructing wells, laying out plans for indigenous agriculture, providing money for the public administration, maybe for building schools, etc. And the human rights person just sits in the corner. Well, she has to do something, she has to have an operative thing. So she needs to think of whether the schools are such that that most of the population can get in, that the schools do not discriminate against women, for instance, or that the resources in agriculture are such that women or the disadvantaged will be able to reap the benefits from that. But hold on, in order to make those points, that human rights person will need to reimagine herself as an agricultural expert with also a lot of economic knowledge. When it's a question of, this may be more to the point, we did two reports of this kind. The other one was on human rights in European Union security and defense policy. And that project had to do also with the European Union monitoring mission in Pristina. And the question was, what does the human rights person in Pristina do? Now, there were, of course, in projects such as this, the funds are always insufficient. And the crucial question is, how do you distribute funds? In Pristina, the issue of security was a big issue. On the other hand, the issue of education was a big issue. On the other hand, the issue of housing was a big issue. On the other hand, the issue of getting an industrial infrastructure going was a big issue. Now, the human rights person, when she looked at these problems, felt that these were daunting. So how could she know whether the development in Kosovo would be best helped by schooling, and what kind of schooling, or industrial installation? So the person had to change herself from a human rights expert into an education expert, into an economic expert, into a construction expert, into a plumbing expert. Now, and she was therefore faced with these choices. The more intensely she was engaged and the more efficient an actor in the development field she became, the more influence, prestige, and professionalism she received. But the more she was assimilated, the more she became indistinguishable from the other people who were already in the ground, thinking hard about how to construct housing, how to do economic infrastructure, how to provide policing because it was dangerous out there, and how these resources would be optimally allocated. So she, when she came back, this hypothetical person, to Helsinki, all of a sudden no longer was a human rights person at all. She was a housing person, policing person, security person, education person, etc. So and her friends think, who are you? You left there as a nice person and here you come back speaking like them. So there's a tragedy involved here. So in order to be able to be an effective operator, she had to learn the language, which led to assimilation, loss of identity, and loss of critical power. Now she could, of course, and the human rights people could, of course, stay out. We don't participate. You're bad guys. We stay outside and throw bricks in the windows of your buildings and demonstrate. And that's great because it preserves critical voice, that protects their values and principles. But so there's a dark side to this. So now she is excluded. She has no influence in the projects, no prestige, she receives no knowledge. So here is where I will end. There is a struggle out there, an institutional struggle, in which regimes or institutions act solipsistically and imperialistically against each other. We are all inside some language game and trying to engage with people who've learned other professional languages. We can try to we can try to overcome them either by going there and speaking their language and changing their preferences into being our preferences. This requires that we learn to speak their language because otherwise they are not convinced. We have to become, in order to change the economic preferences of the WTO, we must become economists and learn the economic language. It's no use having a nice Norwegian sweater as an environmentalist and protesting outside the WTO building. Or maybe it is. If you get the press there, the International Herald Tribune is there, maybe the whole edifice will collapse. It hasn't worked so far. So the point I will want to leave you with is this. These languages are part of our lives. Because they are part of our lives, it's very difficult to have critical distance towards them. When we engage, we just shout harder, as if it would help me as a Finn to start to speak Finnish here and shout harder Finnish. You would not be convinced. You would just think I'm a lunatic and I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I have to speak your language. That, however, comes with a cost. I may no longer, having learned to speak economics, or whatever the field that I want to influence is, I may no longer have those preferences that I used to have. My friendships will be disturbed, and my love affairs will no longer be the same. So, how to create that critical space in which we can, I mean my friends, can be both economically experts, human rights, brilliant human rights activists, great security experts, and so on. And to what extent is that similar or different from my speaking English in front of a Serbian crowd, having Finnish as my native tongue, in a crowd where some of you speak French? Thank you.